Good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome to this, our final lecture in our St. Anne's 300 lecture series. And it's a great pleasure today to welcome both the Archbishop of Dublin and the Rector of St. James's Crinken, who will be dialoguing today about the future of the Church of Ireland. Just to give you a little introduction, well, our Archbishop needs no introduction, of course. Previously Bishop of Clogher, Dean of Cork, and in Christ Church, Oxford, but I think your curacy was Zion Parish as well. So he's done the loop round and back to Dublin. Tom has taken a slightly different route to Crinken, worked with the HSE and the Department of Health, so he has a very sort of what we would like to call now in management speak a 360 view of the thing, so his insights as well should be very interesting as well. But also just to say as well, a very warm welcome to anybody who might be watching us online. But now, enough of me. I will now hand over to both Tom and the Archbishop. Thank you so much. Also, just to say, by the way, that this series is sponsored by the Church of Ireland Centre at Dublin City University, and we thank them for that.
Vicar, thank you very much indeed, and I'd like to thank both you and the Church of Ireland Centre for enabling this to happen. We have, I think, about half an hour, and what Tom and I thought we would do was to put together a couple of question areas or topic areas, and I might say something and he might then have a look at it from his perspective as well. The topic is what they might call a big ask for half an hour, and I suppose all we're trying to do is to pick out a few things which may be of general interest and importance to anybody who knows anything of the Church of Ireland, anybody who's part of it, and anybody who has a passion for its present and its future. So the first thing I suppose we felt we needed to look at was the world of numbers. Numbers across denominations, and consider what we might do. And those numbers are gathered together on a cyclical basis in terms of the census. Now, the most recent census, as we know, for religious observance in the 26 counties showed that the Church of Ireland was currently stable, maybe slightly up on where it was for the last census, but basically stable. Now, the figures in Northern Ireland, I think, are even more worrying. First of all, you might say, why am I worried about stability? Because stability is like treading water in your pajamas, as you might have had to do when you were in school to do one of those swimming medals. You're not actually getting anywhere, it's getting colder, it's getting sharper, and you're not quite holding the energy. So my fear always is that stability is the cousin of inertia. And that's why I would have a slight word of warning about being satisfied about stability. In relation to Northern Ireland, numbers of Church of Ireland people worshipping have been declining steadily since 1948. And I'm not sure that people are aware of that, because the numerical majority, compared with the Republic of Ireland, of Church of Ireland people in Northern Ireland, looks as if it's very, very heavily weighted towards positivity, but within that there is also an anxiety. Now, I might say, why am I anxious about this? It's the same for every denomination. The reason I'm anxious about it is that the content of Christian faith, and the content of Christian faith as the Church of Ireland lives it and teaches it and expounds it, actually matters to me. And the fewer people there are, the less impact it has. So I suppose the question then is, what might we consider doing about it? And I suppose I've just got a couple of suggestions here. One is to make a consistent and a coherent effort to be part of the total community. One of the anxieties there always is about being a minority is that you withdraw into your own limitations. If you have some sense of having what in the world outside there, coming up to Christmas, people would call the quality product, well then I think you need to share it, you need to enjoy it, and you need to let other people know it. And engagement with the community as a member of the Church of Ireland, I think, is front and centre of that. One of the things that we probably don't really know, if you were to go to Spain or Portugal, the Anglican Church traditions there are extremely positive about us in our minority status. Why? Because in the late 19th century, we helped them to establish themselves, and they saw in us a model of how you could survive and you could flourish as a minority in the midst of a massive majoritarian culture. So we should take heart not only from things that are happening now, but things that have happened in history. People often talk about from the bottom up. I would prefer to talk about from the middle out. Because if you're part of that community, you are in the middle and you want to share what you have. So that, I think, is one way of approaching the numbers conundrum. And I'll hand over to Tom, who will have much more sensible things to say.
Not at all, but thank you very much, Your Grace. I just wanted to look at it from an on-the-ground perspective as well, that while numbers are declining, it's not throughout the Church of Ireland that's the case. There's a lot of flourishing going on as well in some parts of the world and in certain parts of Ireland as well. And one of those areas is evangelical churches, and I'm one of them. So again, trying to figure out, well, what is it that sees growth in some of these churches? Well, one of the things that I thought was that evangelical churches tend to be adaptable. They tend to be flexible. They tend to respond to the needs of the community around them, and they have that ability to be able to just go out and do what they need to do where they see a need. The other thing that's big around evangelical churches is this link into community engagement. Certainly the Archbishop had talked about various things around getting communication out there, but also working together. So sometimes churches tend to work in isolation. You're on your own. You'll go and you'll work as part of a community very rarely. But actually with some of the churches in evangelical communities, they're part of the Northside partnerships or the partnership companies. They're part of the local councils. They're part of the social engagement programs within their parishes. And they're looking at where the losses are, where the gains are, and how you can work together to effect the same change. But one of the other things I think around evangelical churches is that there's a strong emphasis on clear doctrinal teaching. And that's not to say that doesn't happen in every church. It certainly does. But I know in my church, people, when they were asking me, how long are my sermons? They were in around 20, 25 minutes. Now, some people might say, oh, but for people who are coming into the church and leaving, they get a very strong sense of what this church is about. What is it that we stand for? What is our evangelical statement? And what is our worship statement? Where do we stand on areas of not only theology, but also on social action? And I think another thing that's very strong in some of these evangelical movements is the worship experience that people find when they go there. It's expressive and it includes contemporary worship as well as, and it doesn't necessarily apply to me, but what they say, dynamic preaching. So the emphasis is on personal transformation. So when somebody comes into a church, you're hearing about a God who cares for you. You're hearing about somebody who is in need coming into the church and feeling that when they're here, they will be transformed in some way. And again, as I say, that is not to say it doesn't happen in other churches, but it's a lot more transparent in some of the evangelical churches, I think. And I understand that the reason that this might be appealing to people, even in a postmodern world, is that people are still broken. They're still hurting. They're still searching. And they may have had a bad experience with the traditional church, or they may have had a bad experience within the Church of Ireland. But that doesn't take away from all of that history and tradition and culture that you've grown up within. And people are still looking. And I know from my own church, for example, I think only about 20% of the church, on average, might be Church of Ireland. Our congregation is made up of Roman Catholics, Brethren, Presbyterians, so it's a big mix of people who are coming. Some of them don't stay. It might be transient, and people might be coming just to look for something different for a while and move on, but at least they're getting some sort of inspiration around where their journey is going to take them. So much of Christianity today is, I think, soft and fluffy, and it strives to be less offensive to a lot of people. But there is still an appetite for spiritual food. And I read somewhere that church can be sometimes like a fast food outlet. The menu is the same no matter where you go. No matter which church you go to, you can expect to see the same hymns, feel the same worship experience, same liturgy, and people know immediately what to order when they're coming in the door of a Church of Ireland. But sometimes the menu doesn't make us full. And you might like the Big Mac or you might like the burger, but are you full when you leave? And similarly with churches, I think there needs to be a big emphasis on that kind of spiritual growth, going back to basics, as it were, and seeing what it was that Jesus Christ taught us, and making sure that when people are coming into church, they're being spiritually fed, and that when they leave, they feel content with what they've had.
I think in listening to Tom, he put his finger on something quite important. Many people shrivel and groan at the word change because they see change as something that deprives them of who they are, not simply of what they're doing. And his use of the word transformation, I think, is very important. And I think that's a word Church of Ireland could hold on to for the days, the years ahead. I wanted, I suppose, maybe to take us maybe into a next stage of what Tom suggested, which is a difficulty, I think, that people currently have about worship itself. I think anybody reasonable or realistic would say that the content of our acts of worship are now extremely clogged. Because since the most recent revision of the prayer book in the Church of Ireland, you basically have everything you used to have in morning prayer and maybe even more, as well as Holy Communion in the same act of worship. And the difficulty is that after COVID, people, I think, have an attention span of a maximum of 45 minutes, probably 35. So worship is now a very, very clogged junction. But I think the difficulty as well is that there is so much information which is coming towards people, and yet people are scratching their heads about the references to liturgy and scripture and all of these things that people of a settled generation have taken for granted. And following up again on what Tom said, I always keep trying to say to myself and to other clergy, people who come to church are not professional Christians. And that, I mean, they may be lifelong disciples, but what I mean is they're not professional Christians in that they don't know all of the intricacies of what many people who are doing this as part of their work take for granted. But I do think there is a gulf there that needs to be closed in terms of people having information to let them engage in transformation. And you can't just expect the church to do it for you, you have to do it to yourself as well. And if you want to call that evangelical, that's fine. I just think it actually is Christianity. So I think that our culture has shifted. There are ways and means of communicating that we're not using sufficiently, because actually most people today live and read visually. So I suppose what might we do? I'm not painting a negative picture, I'm just saying this is a ball that can bounce and we can give it energy and help it to do so. I think the thing to do is to invest in attractive means of celebrating and teaching the content of faith in the Church of Ireland tradition. And I think people who make decisions locally and nationally need to take seriously the fact that people read pictures, often without sound. I'll just give you a small example. Remember travelling home with me and Naveen from this Lewis stop to Milltown on the Lewis, and this guy standing beside me, he was watching a football match on his phone. He watched it, he stepped off, he was still watching it. I imagine by the time he got into his apartment, he was able, with an app on his phone, to switch it on the big screen and to continue to watch the same football match uninterrupted. Now, I might say you don't want the church to like that, but in a way, that's how people fit so many things in. And the other thing I would say is explain and include. And that will lead into something we'll try and say a bit later. No question is too simple, or dare I speak in parentheses, no question is too stupid to ask. Because if people don't feel that what's happening is theirs, they will just fail. So I will be for asserting afresh the scripture and the liturgy, but taking it easy with people who are not, as I would say, professional Christians.
When we talk about liturgy and scripture and doctrine, we all assume that we all know what we're talking about. And I think one of the problems is that the church is so diverse in its views and its understanding of what it is to be a Christian. So I step back and I acknowledge everything that, Your Grace, you've said about the Church of Ireland and the structures and the leadership, and moving out to people who don't understand what it is that we do and why. But I'd also step back and ask, do people in our own church know why we do things and what we do things for? Church speaks different things to different people. Christianity can be understood historically and culturally. It can be understood institutionally, doctrinally, liturgically, spiritually, and personally. And when we get all of those different things influencing what it is that we believe as an individual, there can be some confusion within the church. So one of the things that I did when I took on the role in Crinken was to have a strategy evening. And I thought this was my HSE way of doing things, is make sure that the voice of the people is heard in so many ways as I could. We had 87 people come on a wet Tuesday evening, and we split them up into tables, and we talked about evangelism and outreach, because that was an important piece of the church. We spoke about what it means to be our church. What do we understand to be our church and who we are? And then the next question is, what do we want to be? Whether it's ourselves or what do we want to be perceived as around the community around us. What was interesting about the whole exercise was that there was great consensus. So there was no issue around where we wanted to go, how we wanted to get there, and the target group. But one of the interesting things that came up in the responses back, and these were more than 10 responses, I noted them down as noteworthy. What do we mean by evangelism? So this was the congregation saying, we always talk about it, but what do we actually mean by it? The second question that we don't often think about, and you've touched on it, Archbishop, was who are we targeting and why? And then the third thing is, what message do we want to provide? And I suppose when we talk around evangelism and when we talk about reaching out to people and when we talk about expanding, these are the things that we need to be inside the church clear ourselves. What is it that we want ourselves to be? What is it we want to say? What is it we want to reflect? And then, can we do it collectively? And if we can't do it as part of one church, can we get 2 or 3 churches together to do it? And if we can't do it as 2 or 3 churches, can we do it as a diocese? So this is the whole point about using resources that we know other churches have, that we know the state has. So there's lots of things, for example, we do with homeless in Crinken. So we provide food for charities that are looking after homeless people. But we don't do that in isolation. We do it with government agencies. We get our food from the food bank, that's the government food bank, and we work with people like St. Vincent de Paul and Purple House and all of these agencies, because we know that we can't do it on our own. And if you want to affect change, you need to bring others with you. Now, what that does is it brings people who wouldn't darken the doorstep of our church normally into the church to meet and greet with us, to see what we do and realize we're not so scary, So there's lots of ways to bring people in, and I suppose one of them is harnessing the people and the community around you and other churches around you as well. So lots of ways to think about liturgy and doctrine, but the main thing is, I suppose, that Jesus' liturgy was love one another. The rest will take care of itself.
Tom, again, thank you very much for that really rooted perspective. I'm not quite sure if we're running out of time, but I think we're running into time. So I thought what I might do is maybe conflate maybe two areas, and we can take them together, and that will still give opportunity to do something else. Transform and commend are two words that I've taken from what I've heard from Tom thus far. Let's not obsess around change and its anxieties. Commendation, I think, is a very fruitful way to view words like mission and evangelism, which again can make particular toes curl backwards. We needn't be frightened of those. Sometimes it's the language, sometimes it's the association that makes it difficult for us to take these things as seriously as they are at the root of our faith. Thus far, we may have spoken as if Christianity and the Church of Ireland exist in a bubble. And if I take you back to the census, everybody kind of says, well, the public face of Ireland has changed. If you look at what happened, for whatever reasons, on Thursday, Friday and Saturday nights, on the streets of this city, the whole question is now a really complex interaction of people who have not met before and are not meeting in communities. And there are people who simply don't want them to meet. There are people who want some people simply to leave, and to leave yesterday. So what am I about to say? I'm about to say that interfaith engagement really has to be part of the present and the future of the Church of Ireland. Once again, people can be a bit squeamish about this, because they see it as a kind of vegetable soup into which you put whatever faith ingredients you have, and you hope that it will be palatable for anybody and everybody. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the dialogue of life and the dialogue of ideas, because they can work together. If people can work together in neighbourhoods, they can begin to make more space for one another and have a more fruitful life themselves. Something that has happened to us in, I would say, an angry post-Christian Ireland is that we have separated faith and culture. The thing is that many people who come from abroad bring their faith and their culture in the same suitcase and on the same laptop, and they live that in their lives. In many parts of the world, people are accustomed to living their faith not solely in religious buildings, but actually celebrating them on the street. So I think the interfaith component is something that, to me, is very important for the present and the future life of the Church of Ireland. And I hope you have sensed that from what Tom and I have said. It's not a question of scolding people for what they're not doing. It's actually taking threads to create a bigger tapestry, cutting threads where they're not actually making any impact, but also letting the thing grow organically in that way. And one of the best ways, I think, that we in the Church of Ireland can help in that interfaith understanding is to take something from the heart of our own tradition, which is the 5 marks of mission of the Anglican Communion. Now let me just run through them for you. We've worked on them and we, as it were, simplified them to 5 T's. One is tell, one is teach, one is tend, one is transform, and one is treasure. So what do we tell? We proclaim the kingdom of God. What do we teach? Under this heading comes teaching, baptism, and nurture in the faith. What about tending? That's responding to human need. And that's taking words like pastoral out of the hands exclusively of clergy, and giving that into the hands of all Christian disciples. And then you move to transformation. That's actually the transformation of human structures and bringing questions and issues of justice into who we are and the heartbeat of what we do on a daily basis. And then the final one is treasure, which has to do with treasuring God's creation, recognizing that we are part of it, rather than sitting on top of it and making it do our bidding. Now, if I take you back to the interfaith engagement, let's hold on to transformation and treasuring, because those things, those activities can be done with people of any faith and people of motivation from outside the faith system. But if you go to the telling, the teaching, and the tending, those have their own expression in other world faith traditions. And that, I think, is where the Church of Ireland needs to go very quickly, and create a fresh sense of community, where the transformation and the treasuring are done in partnership with everybody who can do it. And we respect the overlap and the distinction between what we tell, what we teach, and how we tell, with the way in which it's done in other faith cultures. So I suppose there's two things coming together at the same time. One is the pivotal, facility that's given us through those 5 marks of mission in our self-understanding, and actually connect us with why God the Father sent the Son, and why the Son sent the Spirit. So another word where people grow theological. This is actually facilitating the Church of Ireland in being an institution that is unself-consciously and relaxedly theological in its own self-understanding, and connect that, as I say, with those of other world faiths. So Tom, if I've jumped a bit, I'm sorry, but I just think we're heading in the direction of 5 to 2. Not instantly, so you're okay.
Duly warned. So, I just concur with everything you've said, but I won't leave it at that, because I did do some homework and I'm not going to let it go to waste. But let me tell you, things around ourselves as a church, when we talk about interfaith, you're right, people start, what's that about? It's very cold, it's very something we don't want to get involved in. And I think that's part of the big problem, is that we don't educate ourselves about other faith traditions. Who are they? What do they represent? Are my biases valid or not? Do we promote and respect a way to have open dialogue with people from other faiths? Sometimes we don't, because we're afraid to talk to them, because we don't know much about it. Do we identify common ground? The Archbishop is always talking about looking for connection, looking for ways that we can agree on things rather than what do we disagree on. And that leads to engagement in interfaith. And I'll hurry up this part, but after Christ's resurrection, Christianity emerged from what we kind of generally assumed to be a peasant peace movement. But the key thing in that movement was that people called each other brothers and sisters. It wasn't just a term, people meant it. It was a place where people came, Jews, Gentiles, there was a mix of people from every background and tradition. But the one thing that caused them to stay was the sense of welcome, the sense of connection. And it was certainly not the theology, because that wasn't fully thought out. The Church of Ireland is the same. We have a great tradition. We are afloat, but we probably are not moving. We're like a ship with an anchor down. The early church was a way of life, and we sometimes forget it. It was a way of life. It was loving one another. It was inclusive. And it was attractive, and that's what brought people in through the doors. And so we've a lot that we can learn if we just simply go back to the New Testament.
So I think you've now given us 3 words, Tom. One was transform, the other was commend, and now you've talked about connecting. One of the things I think where we need to, as it were, stop at the traffic lights and have a look at how we make provision for people to be in our church settings. And it's very hard to work out exactly how to say this, but if I make a stab at it, and if it's not as generous or as comprehensive as I'd like it to be, I'm sorry. I'm talking about engaging with people with learning disabilities and with other types of disability, and how their belonging to the community can be fostered. One of the things I think that is a miracle of modern science, modern psychology, and understanding of the human person is that we have a stronger picture and a more detailed understanding of how and why people react the way they do to things. And also I think there's a much greater publicly structured sympathy for people who, in our terms, can't quite do that. I remember as a small child visiting in the parish with my father, who was also an ordained person. And I would find that there might be somebody a bit older than me, but nonetheless not of, as it were, a completely different generation, who was sitting in a corner in a chair. And I would go and sit with that person and talk to them and listen to them, try to engage with them, let them engage with me. And that, I would have to say, is part of my motivation for being ordained at all or sticking at it. What we have now is that people who used to be confined out of safety and panic by the rest of their family to their home have a greater opportunity, but with tremendous obstacles in their way, to make their own goal of life as a shared activity. And I do think that engaging with this for the present and in the future is an iconic opportunity for the Church of Ireland. And that will involve enabling people to express their spirituality in ways that they can. It will also enable those who are up and running in the churches we've made it to be less, dare I say, Darwinian in their understanding of what the church is and for whom it is. Because one of the things that I think we need to do, you can call it whatever word you like, but we need to offer to one another and to those who are on the outside looking in safe affection. That, I think, is something that will actually stand us in extremely good stead. The Sunday we've just come out of, the Sunday of Christ the King, it's in Matthew chapter 25. It talks really about those who are remaindered in the society, those who had needs that we didn't even see. There's no need to feel guilty about that. If it's pointed out to us, we can do something with that insight. And I think that we need to work hard and enjoy that work to facilitate the flourishing of people who have particularly learning and physical disabilities, to make the contribution to the churches. I'll just give you one more small example. It was a parish in this diocese where I had confirmation, and there were 6 candidates. And the rector, who was a complete realist, and the woman, very often those two go together, she said to me, look, Michael, there's no point asking the questions, because, to be perfectly honest, the people who are here with you for confirmation will not be able to answer them. And I said, it's not a problem. Why don't all of us stand and hold hands, and I'll ask the question, and you can answer it. So there are ways into this, there are ways through it, there are ways where you do not need to offer diminishment, and those categories ought not to be there. Now, I think that perhaps is another word that I could add at this stage to Tom's words, transfiguration. Thank you.
Not much to add, but one of the practical experiences of inclusivity in the church, and it's not something that can happen in every church, but it's a good example of what happened in Crinken, was they removed the pews. I'm not saying you can do it here at all. But what it was doing in Crinken was, we have 3 people with wheelchairs. And what I didn't realize was the transformation psychologically for them was they could sit wherever they wanted. They weren't confined to the back, they weren't confined to the side, they weren't hushed. They could come into church like anybody else, and they could say, I choose to sit there. We could move the chairs out, and we could put them where they wanted to go. It's just a very practical thing. I think for people with intellectual disabilities, again, not every church has the ability to do it, is the audio-visual component. We have PowerPoint, we have videos that we play. Our Sunday club uses an awful lot of those sensory materials. We have books with materials in them. Just a way to make people feel that they were welcome no matter what, and that they're not pushed into a corner somewhere. So I think there's a few things that we could do, and again, they come from that ability to say, you know, you're always expected to come here, and that's not always the best thing to do, but if you're here, your journey here will be a comfortable one, and you will be welcomed, and you will be supported while you're here. And again, coming back to what I had said earlier around working with agencies, we have, through our storehouse, worked with agencies who have occupational therapists, who have speech and language therapists, who are coming and using some of the storehouse food and bringing it off to families. But they've also come back and said, how can we volunteer for you? So again, it's about bringing them in and giving us training around what do we say to somebody who has an impairment of some point. What do we do to make sure that they feel encouraged, knowing that we're not clinicians, and sometimes there's a danger that you want to be all things to all people in the church, but we always have to know our limitations as well. So there's again this whole ability to synergize with existing community groups, with existing services in the area to make the church a better and more inclusive place.
Final thing I want to do is not to have you listen to me, but actually have you listen to Tom. Because Tom has really, I think, very definitely undersold himself, and the way in which he now finds himself with direct responsibility for a parochial community, which is a trustee church, a parochial community in the diocese, having previously worked full-time in the HSE. And the way in which he made that transition into ordained ministry in the Church of Ireland, I think is something of the present for the future, and I think it will be something which will become more and more a norm in the future. I say that again, not out of despair around numbers or buildings or anything, but because of the energy that comes from taking what we refer to as the self-supporting ministry route. Because while Tom was training for ordained ministry, he was working full-time in the HSE. In the early period of his ordained life, he was doing the same. He has now made a decision, as it were, to do a job of work which is full-time independent responsibility within the church, having all of that behind him. And I'm fascinated to hear from him how you actually connect discipleship with working in a stake body, and how in that context you remain as fresh and refreshing and positive as he is. And that, I think, is a springboard for connectivity between a distinction that we've made in the Church of Ireland, which is there, but need not be a pair of exclusion zones, that is, lay people and clergy. So thank you for giving me a chance, and I'd like to give the final word to Tom as he might take us briefly through a journey with the HSE and the Church of Ireland.
Briefly being the key. So I think part of the energy is that I haven't been in the church for so long that I have gotten used to all of the politics and all of the work that goes with the community work that we talk about. I actually thought that being in the church was like my self-supporting ministry piece. I'd come up on a Sunday, I'd do my piece of work, I'd preach, and I'd go home, and it all sounded wonderful. And I thought, gosh, that would be a nice job. I have realized how very, very time-consuming it can be. But it's still energizing, and let me tell you why. I suppose I grew up within the health system, and 30 years working in the health system within primary care, mental health and palliative care. It was always human connection that brought me into the health service, and I think it's human connection brings us into a church and into a parish as leaders. But I also think it's looking for how we can express ourselves in certain ways. And I think, again, I'm surprised that the HSE is a place that is very medicalized and it's very clinical, but they're moving very quickly towards this whole person care approach, which allows us as a kind of a health sector and allows us as the spiritual church sector to be able to come in and work together to say, well, what is it that makes up a person? Well, it is the physical, it is the mental, but it is the spiritual. The spiritual is often denied, but actually it's getting into dialogue with the HSE as it stands now. But when I was working as a social worker and when I was working in palliative care, I realized that there's a huge connection and a huge spirituality within people. They don't often express it, but it's there. And that kind of piece of me coming from a HSE perspective and giving out to other people is something that's wonderful. But we don't often realize that it's what's coming in as well helps us transform services. So the more that I was engaged in learning around the work of Jesus, or learning about mission, learning about care, faith, hope, which is a big thing in mental health, being able to bring that into a work environment actually was very easy for me, because these were the things, although they put clinical labels on it. So instead of hope, they might have resilience. Instead of supports and mediation and all of that, we had prayer, we had ritual, we had liturgy, and all of these things could interconnect with what we were doing in the health service. So it made it very easy for me to work on a mental health policy, to talk about whole person care in a way that wasn't overtly spiritual, but certainly it allowed for the policymakers to be able to bring some of that church piece into it and say, well, actually, you may not be talking about spirituality, but we know you are, and so we get it. So the new policy is really around spreading out and saying, yes, we can use churches, we can use the voluntary sector, we can use community spirit, we can all work together, because at the end of the day, while the church might have some negative history at the moment, while people might have negative connotations with it, it's also a very strong outlet for people, because most people coming into church are looking for help because they need both spiritual, but they also probably need mental and physical, because that's how I came to the church. So again, I suppose it's about using your life experience and saying, you know, where is God in all of this? And making sure then that you're not shy about being innovative about how you introduce God into your work-life balance, which is something that motivated me every day, not only in my HSE work, but also in what was my voluntary work before I became full-time in the church. So there's lots of opportunities to integrate faith into your workplace, and I could speak about it for hours, but I won't, because I'm under time constraints. But speak to me afterwards if you'd like to know more about how that works. And thank you, Archbishop, for the hour. Oh, that's it? Yeah, okay.
Well, I would like to thank both the Archbishop Michael and Tom as well very much for their insights, for their talk. There's plenty for us to think about and to ponder. I just wanted to also say that if you want to see the Church of Ireland at its outgoing best, please do come here at 6:30 p.m. on the 4th of December to the launch of the appeal from this diocese for the Diocese of Jerusalem. You are all invited to that, and you will actually see a very generous vision which diocesan councils, which the Archbishop have formulated and are doing to help in a very practical way. And then also, by the way, on the 8th, if you'd like to come to a cracking concert, we're having a Bach cantata here as a part of our celebrations of our 300th anniversary of witnessing in the centre of this community. But enough about that for the moment. I would just like to reiterate my thanks both to Tom and to Michael for their wonderful talk and their generosity in their time and in sharing their insights with us. Thank you so much.
one.